The evolution of buyer representation and the introduction of the real estate agency disclosure form. As real estate approached the late 1980s, the majority of brokers and agents across the country were grappling with the concepts of buyer representation and exclusive buyer representation. By 1991, in many major metropolitan areas, including Phoenix, the concept of buyer representation had become more prevalent, especially as large mega-brokerages began adopting the practice. As these larger firms led the way, more and more brokers followed suit. In March 1992, the Arizona Association of Realtors, AAR, introduced the Real Estate Agency Disclosure and Election READE form. The primary purpose of this form was twofold. 1. To disclose the types of agency relationships that an agent can and/or is willing to offer, and 2. To allow clients to elect the type of agency relationship they wish to have with the broker. The READE form was not binding upon the client. It merely served as a disclosure and an election form, not creating a contractual relationship. This means a buyer could sign multiple READE forms with different agents and not be bound to any one agent, which was a common occurrence, often to the dismay of agents. Understanding the Real Estate Agency Disclosure and Election Form. The Real Estate Agency Disclosure and Election Form is a crucial document used to inform both buyers and sellers about the agency relationships in a real estate transaction. It clearly explains how a broker and their licensees will represent the parties involved in the transaction, outlining the broker's duties and responsibilities under different agency relationships. Disclosure section. The disclosure section outlines the various agency relationships that can exist between the broker and client, highlighting the specific duties the broker owes to the buyer or seller in each scenario. Buyer's broker. A broker exclusively representing the buyer, not the seller, must act in the buyer's best interests and is required to uphold fiduciary duties such as loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting. Even if the buyer's broker is compensated by the seller or the seller's broker, the fiduciary duties to the buyer remain unchanged. Seller's broker. A broker representing the seller must act in the seller's best interests, ensuring the best possible price and terms for the seller. Similar fiduciary duties apply, including loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting. However, the seller's broker may also represent other sellers with similar properties. Broker representing both the seller and buyer, limited representation broker. A broker can represent both the buyer and seller in a transaction, but only with the informed consent of both parties. This dual representation involves limitations, particularly regarding disclosure and loyalty. The broker cannot disclose confidential information from one party to the other without written consent. There are inherent conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, and confidentiality in this situation. Additionally, the form stresses that brokers must exercise reasonable care, honesty, and disclose material facts that could affect the transaction. The law also identifies specific exceptions to disclosure, such as deaths or crimes on the property, per ARS, paragraph 32-2156, Election section. The election section allows the buyer or seller to choose their preferred agency relationship. This decision determines the level of service and advocacy the client will receive during the transaction. The options include buyer's broker, seller's broker, dual agency, broker representing both parties. It is important to note that compensation for the broker is negotiable and separate from the agency relationship election. A separate written agreement between the buyer-seller and the broker will document the terms of compensation, and in cases where the seller offers compensation to the buyer's broker, that amount is negotiable. Key considerations. Fiduciary duty. The broker is required to act in the best interest of the party they represent, maintaining loyalty, confidentiality, and fulfilling their fiduciary duties. Limitations in dual agency. When the broker represents both the buyer and seller, conflicts in loyalty, disclosure, and confidentiality arise. Written consent is required for the disclosure of confidential information. Final responsibility. While the broker guides the transaction, it is the responsibility of the buyer and seller to protect their own interests. Both parties should carefully read all documents to ensure they fully understand the terms of the transaction. Purpose of the real estate agency. Disclosure and election form. The primary purpose of this form is to ensure transparency in the agency relationship, making both parties aware of the type of representation they have and the broker's duties. It also emphasizes that the form does not establish the broker's compensation. The compensation is fully negotiable and will be documented separately. The form requires both the buyer and seller to acknowledge receipt of the disclosure and confirm that they understand the type of agency relationship they are entering into. Buyer's broker, fiduciary duties and responsibilities. The buyer's broker represents the buyer exclusively, meaning the broker works solely in the buyer's best interest, not the seller's. The broker has several key fiduciary duties. Loyalty, acting in the buyer's best interest, even above personal or financial gain. Obedience, following the buyer's lawful instructions. Disclosure, providing the buyer with all material facts about the property and transaction. Confidentiality, keeping the buyer's financial and personal information confidential. Accounting, properly handling any money or property during the transaction, such as earnest money. Even though the buyer's broker may receive compensation from the seller, their fiduciary duties to the buyer remain intact, ensuring that the broker remains loyal to the buyer throughout the transaction. Seller's broker, fiduciary duties and responsibilities. The seller's broker exclusively represents the seller and works to secure the best deal possible for the seller. Similar to the buyer's broker, the seller's broker owes the following fiduciary duties. Loyalty, prioritizing the seller's interests above all else. Obedience, following the seller's lawful instructions. Disclosure, sharing all material facts about the property and transaction with the seller. Confidentiality, keeping the seller's personal and financial information confidential. Accounting, managing any money or property, such as earnest money or escrow funds, in the transaction. Broker representing, both seller and buyer, limited representation broker. A broker may represent both the buyer and the seller, but only with their informed consent. In this arrangement, the broker's ability to fully advocate for one party is limited by potential conflicts of interest. The broker must carefully manage their duties of loyalty, confidentiality, and disclosure. Written consent is required to disclose any confidential information from one party to the other. General broker duties. Regardless of the agency relationship, brokers must always exercise reasonable care in the performance of their duties. Be truthful and honest with both the buyer and seller. Disclose material facts that could affect the transaction, such as title issues or physical defects in the property. There are exceptions to what brokers are required to disclose, including the property's history of death, crime, or health-related conditions, as outlined in ARS, paragraph 32-2156. Responsibility of the buyer and seller. While the broker provides guidance and expertise, it is the responsibility of the buyer and seller to protect their own interests. Both parties should carefully review all agreements to ensure they are comfortable with the terms of the transaction. Final acknowledgement and signature. The form concludes with the buyer and seller signing to acknowledge receipt of the disclosure and confirming their understanding of the agency relationships available. It is crucial to understand that this form does not establish an employment agreement, but simply outlines the broker's duties and the client's choices. The real estate agency disclosure and election form ensures that both buyers and sellers are fully informed about the type of agency relationship they are entering into. It clearly outlines the broker's fiduciary duties, the types of agency relationships available, buyer's broker, seller's broker, or dual agency, and the broker's compensation. By signing the form, the buyer and seller confirm their understanding of the broker's duties and responsibilities, ensuring transparency and reducing potential conflicts in the transaction.